All right, it's great to see, sorry, we jumped ahead there. Great to see a lot of participants jumping on. We had almost 100 registrants to this webinar. So kudos to the LSO team to get this out. I think a lot of people are excited in the community to see what the data looks like, considering what was shared a couple of years ago in the last round of review of where Canada sits in terms of medicine launches. Okay, we're a couple of minutes past the hour, so I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs. We work closely with Life Sciences Ontario, who is hosting this webinar on the question, is Canada losing its status as a priority medicine launch country, drawing on insights from IQVIA. And we'll introduce experts from, of course, the leader of Life Sciences Ontario is the opening panelist, and we've got one of the leaders at IQVIA as well. Canada has long been considered a top global jurisdiction for new medicine launches, and we'll learn more about that shortly. There have been many changes, ongoing changes to the pharmaceutical policy environment over the past decade, especially in the past 5 or 6 years. And so to help inform and contribute to this discussion, Life Sciences Ontario has worked closely with IQVIA, the global leader in health data and analytics, to update research that they undertook in 2020 to determine whether and how Canada is faring with respect to changes in its global standing in launches. Just in terms of logistics, note that observers, we're not going to call on you specifically, but we would encourage you to use the chat panel or the Q&A panel, and I'll do my best to help bring those questions forward. And special thanks in advance to one of the folks in the LSO community for putting a question in advance. We've shared that with the panelists. We may not get to all of your questions and comments, but we can get back to you offline. And if the time allows, we will get to them toward the end of the webinar. Today's session is being recorded and it will be published on Life Sciences Ontario's YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that. And so now I'm going to introduce our presenters, starting with Jason Field. Dr. Field is President and CEO with Life Sciences Ontario, the industry voice for the life sciences sector in this province. Since joining LSO in 2011, yes, over 10 years, Jason, you know, you've drawn on your time as a bench scientist, as an academic, and time in government to help build the sector in the province and across Canada. And just congratulations again for some of the amazing things that have happened in the province just recently, and that will be built on. And you're going to talk a little bit more about that. Brad Milson, here in Ottawa, usually with me, although yesterday you were in Montreal. It seems like you can be anywhere these days, Brad. Senior Principal, Real World Solutions with IQVIA, where you deliver market access strategies and real world evidence-based solutions for the pharmaceutical industry and stakeholders. And you've been there since 2013. We're going to have to celebrate a decade of Brad at IQVIA soon too. That's something else. But it's not just at IQVIA. You know, your MBA in biotech and your experience even at the global level is quite something. Although you're based here in Canada, you're going to take us around the world and help position where Canada sits. So it's really great to have you here, Brad. So over you to Jason to help set this up and talk a little bit about where we are today.
Well, thanks, Bill, and thanks for the kind introduction. You didn't have to sound so incredulous that somebody would actually continue to employ me for over a decade, but I'm very grateful that LSO has, and to be able to be part of this amazing community. You know, Canada has a complex review and reimbursement system for new medicines, Right from the start, when we compare, to the U.S. Since mid 2019, 129 medicines have been approved by the FDA, and less than half of those were submitted to Health Canada. And for those medicines that are launched here, they have a long and uncertain commercialization pathway. We've all been very familiar with the PMPRB and the changes that have sort of been underway over the last 6 years, the cloud of uncertainty that these changes have brought, and the impacts that they've had on our position within global launch sequencing. Beyond PMPRB, there's health technology assessments. Many times, again, lots of uncertainty, restrictive reviews at an HTA level, and oftentimes overly focused on one thing, which is pricing. And then after HTAs, you're looking at the PCPA, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and the bulk negotiations that take place there. Again, on average, we're looking at 10 months to complete that PCPA process before it reaches the provinces. And then depending on the province, there's a long variation between, which province you're in terms of the timeline to getting access for these new medicines and innovations. So all of these different issues have a compounding effect, which has led to access delays for patients across the board. And as you can see from this data, we aren't headed in the right direction. The time to listing is getting longer and longer, and it now takes upwards of 1.5 years from a notice of compliance to a first listing. And again, thanks to IQVIA for sharing this data. So credit to them. And you'll be hearing more from Brad around the data specific to drug launches in a few moments. This really puts Canada way behind its peers. It's not like others are having the same level of challenges that we're having with these delays. Canada is not faring as well compared to other countries in the OECD 20, and in fact, ranking 18th out of 20 jurisdictions. And the worst part about these delays to access, they disproportionately impact some of our most vulnerable patient populations, such as those with rare diseases. So that's a bit of doom and gloom, but there are reasons to be optimistic. And Bill alluded to some of these. I'll start off by saying that with as related to PMPRB, for example, we have seen recent announcements and moves by the federal government to remove some of the most uncertain and problematic aspects of those regulation changes. That's a step in the right direction, and I hope that is the beginning of a new dialogue between the industry and the government. We've also seen, in provinces like Quebec and most recently in Ontario, and also at the federal level, dedicated life sciences strategies and commitments made by governments to prioritize the industry. And again, it's an opportunity for us to really improve the policy environment and accelerate and improve access to health innovations. So today, IQVIA will present the results of its study on drug launches in Canada. This is an update to a study we commissioned a couple of years ago with IQVIA. You will see that some of the recent trends demonstrate that there's still a need for us within the industry and within our broader life sciences community to continue to advocate for better, faster, more predictable commercial pathways to new medicines, to be able to compete with other jurisdictions and attract early drug launches to the benefits of Canadian patients across the board. So with that, Brad, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks everybody for joining today. So really what we are going to cover today is really a data-driven approach to understanding kind of new medicine launches globally and where Canada stands in that global context. There's a lot of ways to talk about, the attractiveness of different jurisdictions for new launches, but we find a kind of a data-driven approach will really help us understand apples to apples how we fare. So in this study, this is actually, as Jason and Bill mentioned, this is a refresh or a second iteration of work that we did a couple of years ago, trying to benchmark Canada in terms of how we stand globally. And really, it was designed to answer two key questions. One is, how does Canada compare in terms of time to launch, proportion of launches, and actual sequence in terms of where we stand in terms of sequence of launches globally, but then also to understand, have we seen changes? And at the time, originally, it was around, a good focus was around the changes with respect to PMPRB, but there are a lot of things happening in the Canadian environment. And we really want to understand in recent years, is that position as a kind of in our tier globally, is that changing, and are the things that we need to be aware of and watch out for? So in terms of how we actually conducted this study, I think I've talked about this already. We really took a data-driven approach. And the challenge with measuring launches globally is you don't have that many in a given year. So just taking a single isolated year on its own, it may not provide you with the best insight you can. So we took a very broad approach to this, a 20-year horizon, and looking at a large number of countries, so the top 25 countries globally, to really give us a very complete window into what's going on. And we chose three key metrics. One is, what is the country's place in launch sequence? So that basically means is who's the first to launch, second to launch, third to launch for any given new therapy. The second metric was, what was that average time to launch? So starting from the first global launch to whichever country, how long did that launch take? And then finally, what was the proportion of launches? It's probably not ideal if you're very quick to launch for those that you do, but then not a lot of things launch in your country. So that kind of rounds out the different measures. And then we also looked at time trends. So do these three key metrics, do they change over time? And what are we seeing in most recent years? The data source that we used is the IQVIA MIDAS database. So this is a global representation of all new product launches across the world. It's the most comprehensive data set of its kind worldwide, and it's driven by essentially sales data, so launch data. 93 countries and a myriad of sources and distribution channels, and it's really kind of the gold standard when it comes to measuring and tracking sales across the world. In terms of the countries that we looked at, as I mentioned, we looked at the top 25. Austria and Sweden, the launch information there was from our quality. For the purposes of the study, we deemed to be not robust enough. We wanted to make sure that we were only capturing countries where we had absolutely robust apples to apples data as best we could. And so this is the list of countries. And launch date was defined as one of two things. One is sales start to accumulate in that country, which means that drug is now available and being sold, or by a actual reported launch date by the manufacturer, and whichever came first was the data point that we used. And this is really irrespective of channel. These can be hospital drugs, retail drugs, privately paid drugs, publicly paid drugs. Really, the goal was to understand, is the drug available in that country? And not necessarily just approved, That's one distinction to make. A drug can be approved by a regulatory agency, but if the drug is not available, it has not launched yet. So really, that's the goal of what we want to look at is would the drug be available for a patient? In terms of how we defined what a new launch was, we wanted to make sure that we are really going after genuine new therapies. So this is a brand new molecule, not a new indication, not a reformulation, new therapies was really the benchmark. We also needed to exclude things that might skew or add noise to the data. Things like generics or biosimilars, vaccines, since there are, every year there's a new version of a flu vaccine, and we didn't want that to distort the data. It also does mean that the COVID vaccines in particular are not part of this analysis, a thing to point out. So we really wanted to get at new therapies launched in the market. And one last kind of look that we took was, do we see trends by different therapeutic classes or areas? So we classified drugs according to international ATC standards to understand the different types of drugs being launched. We also looked at things like rare disease and things like that to understand kind of the nature behind what's being launched and where. So let's get into some of the results. That was just kind of to give you a sense of what you're looking at in terms of methodology. So we'll start with kind of an overview of our position, or Canada's position, over the last 20 years. And that's what we'll look at first. And so this gives you actually a broad view of where we stand. So this is the last 20 years of data. And if you look on the vertical axis, so up, down, that's proportion of launches by country. So out of all new launches across the globe, what percentage did each country actually get? And then left to right, we have time. So what's that time to launch from a median time to give you a sense of how long it's taking for that country to get that number of launches. So you can see a couple of trends here. First is, probably no surprise, US is the top country, both from a time to launch. They are almost always the first to launch, as well as the proportion. Now, it's not 100%. That's because there are occasions where something is approved in Europe or Canada, but not US, and obviously vice versa. But what's clear is it's kind of the gold standard, or the benchmark that we've benchmarked everything else against. The next kind of grouping that you can see is Germany and UK, which both tend to have a very high proportion of launches and tend to be the first European countries, or the first ex-US country to receive those launches. So kind of short, median time to launch and high proportion of overall share of launches. The next grouping, and this is kind of where Canada stands, and has kind of traditionally stood between, which is kind of Canada is, if you look, kind of very quick relatively, so kind of close to Switzerland, both from a time to launch as well as proportion of launches. So very interesting. Switzerland is a very similar dynamic to Canada in terms of a unique regulatory agency that it uses, and a first-class healthcare system. What can also be noted is, it is interesting to note back at the right-hand side, and this is, in recent years starting to change, but China historically has been a late to launch and not a lot of launches. It's interesting since currently today, China actually represents the second largest market globally, next to the US for pharmaceuticals. So if we break this down a bit into some of those specific metrics that saw at a high level in the last slide, and we look at the median time to launch. What we can again see is Canada is about 1.2 years median time to launch. So that's the time it took from first global launch to when Canada saw a launch for a particular product. Note this is over that 20-year horizon. So it's that average or that median over 20 years. And it tends in the last 20 years has been a top tier country, clearly from a time to launch perspective, just after Germany and UK and ahead of several other European countries. And so the next key question obviously is, okay, well, that was all about in the last 20 years. A lot has changed in 20 years. What does that mean today in terms of where we're at? And so here we took a look at a couple of things. One is that median time to launch, and then that rank, or that where we were in terms of that rank or position in terms of launch. And you can see a couple of interesting things. We've historically had a quite stable, since 2013, had a quite stable median time to launch of about a year, and we've typically ranked around 4th or 5th. That changed significantly in 2021, where our time to launch doubled to 2.1 years. And you, as I think was previously mentioned, there's a lot of different reasons that could impact something like this. The obvious one that comes up, which is COVID, which probably impacted time to launch. But what's interesting is the rank also went up. So whatever happened in 2021 in Canada, it disproportionately affected Canada's position. We went from 4th all the way up to 9th. And then in terms of proportion of launches, so that's that our share of the global new product launches over time. That's kind of what we're looking at here. The green being global and the blue being Canada. Just to see, are we tracking with global, and what proportion of global launches are we getting? Now, year for year, the numbers are not going to be the same drugs. We already showed that there is a lag time between a global launch and a Canada launch, but over time, a divergence or parallel gets, lets us see kind of overall what proportion of launches are we getting. And interesting kind of thing to note is in the last few years, so we've roughly kind of tracked around 18 launches or so per year in Canada, peaking to 27 in 2016. And since 2016, we have seen a gradual decline in launches, in number of launches in Canada. Last year being lowest. We have not seen a similar decline on the global side. So global side, actually, if you strike the trend line, continues to increase in terms of number of launches. So you might say there's a growing divergence. It's not, I don't think, conclusive, but you clearly see a trend here. And so then the last view we wanted to look was, okay, year for year, what's that proportion look like and how do we compare against those those 3 key kind of top tier countries of US, Germany, and UK. Again, similarly, you can see in in 2018 and 2019, the proportion of launches that we got within the first 2 years of global launch. So this is kind of looking at starting the clock at when the first global launch was and what proportion of those did Canada get within a 2-year time window. It's kind of a nice metric to see what's coming to Canada, what new is coming to Canada, versus maybe 5 years down the road. So when we look at it from that perspective, 2018 and 2019, we actually see a lower proportion of drugs coming to Canada within the first 2 years of global launch. 2018 being, I think, the low point at 36%, recovering slightly in 2019, but still below the average of the last 10 years. And this compares to Germany and UK, which both have a significantly higher proportion of launches within the first 2 years of global launch. So, one of the viewpoints that we look at is, all right, well, what is not launching in Canada, and or is there anything we can learn from that? So in 2019, among 26 new drug launches globally, 54% of them, as we saw on the last slide, were not launched in Canada within that first 2 years. And the nature of those launches, 8 were in rare disease, 5 were in oncology. Those were the 2 biggest buckets in terms of therapeutic areas. But you can see kind of across the board a variety of therapeutic areas that are not with drugs that were not launching in Canada. And so if I take us to the summary, what appears happening is it does appear that Canada, those key metrics, they have been slipping in the last few years in terms of our tier or our rank in launches, the times, certainly the time to launch, and also the proportion of launches. Now, again, we're dealing with small, small n values here. So 1 year at a time is probably not the best thing to look at, but if you look at it over several years, we're still seeing that trend. So it is noteworthy to understand. We still rank quite highly over the 20-year period behind UK and Germany, as well as in median time to launch, and obviously US remains the benchmark in terms of access to new medicine launches globally. The last year, 2021, there was a dramatic change in terms of the median time to launch in Canada. And there could be several factors, but I'm not sure it's just COVID here, since it seemed to disproportionately affect Canada in terms of that increase in time to launch. And our kind of number of launches has declined year over year since 2016, which we didn't see in the global data. And if you take some averages over the last 5 years to kind of smooth things out, on average, Canada had about 20 new launches per year versus the global average of 34. So with that, I think I will hand it back to Bill or Jason.
Amazing. Okay, thanks so much, Brad and Jason, for the setup. Just another note to everyone that the presentation will be available on LSO's website and to members, as well as the YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that. We're going to stop sharing, although in the Q's and A's and questions, we may want to go back to a slide or two. As usual, Brad, data heavy, a lot of which is really where you live, and it's amazing that you have access to really robust global sources for sales of pharmaceuticals around the world. Can we just start with one question on the data? You were measuring for a global launch to happen, it had to have sold at least in 2 of the major jurisdictions that you reviewed in the top 25. Were there any differences between how you conducted the review in 2020 and 2022 that you can talk to? And maybe a follow-on from that, is this kind of data cut and review something that can be revisited on a regular basis as a sort of a metric for how Canada's faring? So maybe start with the first and then go on to the second.
Sure, I think that's a good and important point. There is some differences in how we measured it this year based off of learnings from our first iteration. And one of the key learnings is there can be a delay in terms of pickup of the data. And globally, that delay can be meaningful. So if you compare the results this year to what we did 2 years ago, you'll see, this data constantly goes through updates as new data comes in. And so this year, what we did to kind of strengthen the conclusions, or at least strengthen the reporting, is we, for Canada specifically, cross-referenced and double-checked across several other data sets that are tend to be a bit more time sensitive. So in Canada, luckily, we have access to claims data, we have access to prescription data, we also have access to market access data. And so we cross-referenced to make sure that we were, as best we can, not missing any launches in Canada that may not have been picked up in the global data set. Now, the reason we didn't use that data to start in the original is that data doesn't exist in most other jurisdictions. It's very specific to Canada. So we wanted to do apples to apples. By doing this, by kind of supplementing with additional data in Canada, we're actually kind of, almost enriching the number of launches in Canada. So if anything, we're overestimating versus the number of launches in Canada versus our global peers. But we felt, for the purposes of what we're trying to do here and tracking a Canada-centric view, it made sense. So that was probably the biggest change that we made in this iteration to make the data for Canada more robust. And certainly this is something that is repeatable and can be used as a benchmark moving forward if to be able to keep track of how we're doing.
Excellent. Jason, just building on one of the data points you brought up earlier, and maybe Brad, you can weigh in on this as well. And it actually goes to the question from one of our participants on the line. Do we know what specific drugs are not being launched in Canada? Is there any way to get a general idea about that? I know, Brad, you gave us some therapeutic areas, but can you build on that data point you brought up earlier around, what's being launched or at least approved in the FDA? Is there something there, Jason, that you can share?
Yeah, so I mean, we have seen specific drugs, and even in discussion with some of our members, right? They've shared with us delays that have occurred. We've surveyed confidentially our members, and so we did a report last year with Research Etc. It's available on our website. We asked global CEOs about specific therapeutic areas, and Brad had shown in his data as well where some of these were. And, to answer the question that was posed by one of the audience members, a lot of times these are not, Me Too therapeutics or, additional things in a already well-developed class. Many times they're rare disease, they're new oncology treatments. These are state-of-the-art medicine, so they do have high impact as well.
Excellent. And building on that, back to you, Brad, do you think that this trend is going to continue? Maybe drawing on some of your discussions with, pharma sector leaders around the world. You're the Canadian expert in a very big consultancy that stretches from Asia to Europe to Canada. And if people want to know about Canada, calling you, what are they asking you, and what is their reaction when you tell them a little bit about Canada?
Sure. The reaction is usually quite a bit of surprise. I have these conversations actually quite a bit. Surprising a lot of newer emerging pharma out there these days. With all of these innovative therapies, a lot of them are coming to market with new companies that have not yet kind of, been to Canada and had that experience. They always tend to be quite surprised and shocked when I start to lay out the land of access in Canada and the complexity of it. And I can tell you, the more complex things get, the more reaction I get that it's kind of they stand back and start to rethink their strategy. They've got to reevaluate the resources it will take, the time it'll take, the impact on other markets, because they're dealing about, Canada's one box in one of many that they've got to manage and deal with. So I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you where things are going to go in the future, but I can tell you the more difficult it is for me to explain how to achieve access, and the more uncertainty there is around whether or not they'll get access, the harder it becomes to make that business case to come. So I think that's kind of, those are the discussions that I typically have.
Amazing. Thanks, Brad. Okay, so Jason, we're going to pretend that you're Tinkerbell for a second, and you've got a magic wand. You're in Ontario, but you're going to go and tap it onto certain initiatives or things that are happening to help reverse this trend. Where do you fly? What do you do?
I like how you went to Tinkerbell and not like Gandalf or something, Tinkerbell. All right, I'll take it. Look, I think it starts with a better dialogue with government. And there's, as I mentioned before, with the federal strategies in place, with the provincial strategies in place, I think there's an opportunity to do this. And we saw this highlighted during the pandemic as we were trying to secure vaccines in very short notice. And, it became apparent that that relationship really wasn't deep and established in what it should be. And so I think there's a recognition, by the federal government, by the provincial governments, and by the Canadian industry and the leaders within it, that we need to do better. So I think improving that ongoing dialogue between the sector, between government, to ensure that we're developing policies, we're developing regulations that are going to improve the predictability of the business climate, clarity of the commercial pathways, and at the end of the day, better access, better timely access to innovations for patients.
So yeah, just build on that a little bit. We're in Canada, right? So we've got the federal government doing, 3 things, and then we've got the provincial governments doing 5 or 6 things with respect to both life sciences, innovations, and from patents to funding. How do you ensure that that the Canadian experiment actually works? And I mean, maybe you can build a little bit about what's happened in Ontario to see this actually work, and then what's going to happen in Ottawa specifically.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, I think the key to it, Bill, is, we have to be respectful of the jurisdictions, right? I mean, the care is delivered at the provincial levels, but the federal government does have a role, in terms of setting some direction and providing support across the board. So I think it's just being very respectful of the roles and responsibilities, and making sure that both the provinces and the feds are aligned and at the table and parts of the discussion with the industry, with patients, with other stakeholders. So it's not an easy process, but it's one that's certainly necessary, I think, to have those positive outcomes. And there's lessons to be learned. Like, you take a look at Ontario, where there's lots of conversations happening now federally around national pharmacare. We look at, a province like Ontario that had the experiment with OHIP Plus, and, that exposed, some challenges, right? We had young patients, for example, that were epileptic. They had access to medications that worked for them, that treated their disease state effectively, and then all of a sudden found themselves without the private coverage that they used to have. And so, you know, Ontario went through a process where we kind of had to thoughtfully unwind that and do a more fill the gaps approach, because a one size fits all doesn't necessarily work. And so as we're thinking broader about a national pharmacare program, there's some lessons to be learned from the provinces as well.
Thanks. Did either of you see the front page of the Globe, and it's on Bloomberg's Wire today as well? Former Finance Minister Bill Morneau spoke to the CD Howe Institute, I think yesterday, and as a former insider just said, you know, Canada is really lagging in terms of a growth agenda, a productivity agenda, and we're not competitive right now. And there was some real concerns and flags being raised there that in some ways mirror some of the litmus test flags that we've seen in this data. And yeah, it would be great if he, I don't know if anyone from CD Howe is on the call today, but to sort of bring a lot of this you know, these perspectives forward, so that policies would be pragmatic and workable and feasible. So that's and I see there's another question in the chat, so we'll just pull that up now in terms of Q's and A's. So someone's looking for greater clarity regarding the specific drugs that Canadians are not getting, or getting later than a 2-year lag, as per the prior question. It seems important to determine the impact, and is this information proprietary? Am I allowed to take that as a moderator? Because we've got a bit of a data set that we
Go for it. Go for it.
Thanks. And I've actually shared that with you, Brad, because we've been back and forth on it too, to try to dig into this question. It's a really simple review. The FDA has an approvals database, what's actually coming out by month. And you can actually hold that up against Health Canada's what's under review or what has been approved. And you'll see, as Jason said earlier, 129 drugs have been approved by the FDA. And here we're taking out diagnostic agents and other products, a similar inclusion exercise is what Brad did. 129 drugs have been approved by the FDA since mid-2019. And less than half of those have been even submitted to Health Canada. And that's still potentially 2 to 3 years away from getting through the Health Canada review, which typically takes a year, half a year if it's a priority review. And then to Jason's point, another year to 2 years for funded access to those medicines. And then the core question, this is going back to you, Brad, launch. When are they actually available and sold? So all that to say that maybe offline we can find you access to a simple PDF that compares it, and it'll show you exactly which medicines are available in the US. I should say approved in the US, not necessarily sold in the US, but that are not available here except potentially through Health Canada Special Access Program, which is another potential source, but that's not generally a good source. I mean, Brad, maybe this is more of a nitty-gritty question. I mean, do you track a sale through SAP? Does that actually hit your radar too?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think that's typically not if it's through SAP, because I don't think it's a sale. I think we look at those on a one-on-one basis.
Yeah, but there have been increased use of SAP because of this growing lag that we've seen. So that's a really important and great question. And so just the follow-up from the person, the measure here was access, first sale versus approval. And you're right, the data set that Brad has reviewed is about first sale. What we're saying that is, though, if you're looking for what's definitely not having a sale here in Canada, you can also look at what's not approved here in Canada, because that's not being sold through regular channels, obviously. I don't know if either of you want to expand on this.
Yeah, and Bill, I think, you know, it's important to note that you know, it's you know, calling out specific drugs. I mean, you can look at these databases and take a look at them, and it's a complex environment. So I think it's dangerous to sometimes call out specific ones, because, you know, for whatever reason, there may be delays in the process and it may not fall on, just specifically that they're not being launched here, or they're being delayed launch here for business reasons or whatever. There could be a multitude of reasons. So I think that's our hesitation a little bit to call out some of the specific ones. However, more importantly, what I think is that what we're sharing here today is calling out some specific therapeutic areas. I think that's very important, because when we think about rare disease state, there are a lot of conditions that are, unmet needs. And so we're talking about life-changing medications. When we're talking about cancer drugs, you're talking about, some revolutionary treatments that can have very high impact into a disease or diseases that affect so many people. So these are important therapeutic areas. These are important medications and innovations. I think that's the take-home message.
Yeah, because I love data, and I'm going to just jump in here and share my screen really briefly to give you a quick snapshot of what we've seen. Only 61 Health Canada submissions versus 129 FDA approvals. And, going back to mid-2019, here's Parkinson's disease that's not coming to Canada. Pain-free light exposure in adult patients with phototoxic reactions to the skin. And then, if you go through here, thyroid eye disease, metastatic gastrointestinal stromal tumors, there's a lot of red. The greens start to come in, of course, in, going back to 2 years ago, 2020, but the closer you get to today, you get a lot more red, and it's everything from plaque psoriasis to products that are disease areas that I'm sure Jason can pronounce better than I can. Pyruvate kinase deficiency, hemolytic anemia. Anyway, I'll stop there. I just couldn't help, because it was almost a triple question on the same issue, and it's a very simple database to run to see what's available 50 kilometers away for so many Canadians, or at least what's approved. And sorry to be so stressing that. I know, Brad, we've had lots of discussions over the last 3 years about approved versus sold.
Yeah.
And that's an important issue. Actually, I should say on the PMPRB and Health Canada, often they would say, look how many approvals we have. And I think that in the discussions with them, we had to remind them that that's actually, many of these are not actually sold in Canada because the launch did not happen.
And that's an important element, Bill, to the last question that was raised in terms of why submissions aren't happening in Canada, or even sometimes why approved drugs aren't being launched or made accessible in Canada. And I think that's the point that we're trying to get to today, is that this is a bit of a bellwether. It's a bit of an indicator for us about the complexity of the environment that basically the Canadian system has evolved to. And it's an opportunity for us, post-COVID, with new opportunities, with these life sciences strategies in place, a new dialogue with government to sort of address some of these issues and challenges to make our ecosystem less complex, more predictable, better clarity. And the end goal is really making sure innovations get to the hand of patients and better health outcomes. So I think that's really the take-home message today, is that this data is an indicator for us. it's an important metric. It's something we're going to have to kind of continue to keep looking at. But at the end goal, I think that the opportunity is now for us to start implementing changes to the Canadian environment.
Excellent. That might be a good way to end it. Although, Brad, do you have any final thoughts to leave with the folks on the data? And just congratulations. You're representing IQVIA, but there's a big team behind you that helped pull this off. So, and I should say it at LSO as well to actually get this off the ground. A 45-minute presentation doesn't really do justice to the hours of work that went into it. So, well done, Brad.
Thank you. And I do want to thank my team, Purva, Huijun, and Jijing, who are smarter minds than me, that all supported me. I step into these things and become the talking face, but they really are the ones that put in the effort. So I want to thank them for this work as well.
Awesome. Any other things to end on, Jason, or what do you think?
No, I just want to thank you, Bill. Great job moderating the session. Thanks for all your support. And Brad, it's always a pleasure working with you and the team at IQVIA. You know, as an organization, I'm very passionate about evidence-based advocacy as much as I am about evidence-based policymaking. So having a credible organization like IQVIA providing the support to us is been critical. It's been a great relationship and one that we value very much. So thank you.
Excellent. We'll see you all soon. Thanks so much, Jason. Bye, Brad. Take care.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Get out and vote.
Yeah, that's right.
Bye.
Bye.